years, and it's something that I have a great pleasure to steward, because it's what we're doing is creating really community. And I'll talk a little bit about through the presentation as to what I mean by that.
I forgot to mention one thing, Keith. I hope you don't mind if I interject just for a second.
Yeah, go.
We did get Keith's permission to record his presentation today, so we are going to try to record that. I'm not exactly sure the extent to which it's going to record everyone's faces along with Keith's. So if you don't want to be part of the recording, feel free to stop your video. Just wanted to mention that. Okay.
Great. Now I'm just fumbling to figure out what Frank and I did to make sure this shows.
Fair enough. And I just re-enabled share screen, so you should be able to take that over.
Okay, thanks. I think this should do it. Are you seeing my screen now?
I'm only seeing you, Keith.
Okay.
So Frank, you authorized his screen share? Oh, great. We're in business.
Better. See it now?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And so there's this parallelism between what happens in open source technical collaboration and patent collaboration that's increasingly emerging, and more generally intellectual property collaboration, to ensure that people recognize that open source is really a social movement. It's about collaborative development, increasing innovation, and really kind of a manifest destiny of an idea that was talked about a lot in the 90s about co-opetition. We cooperate to compete more effectively, and open source is probably a very good model for that, where companies come together. Very often they're competitors. They work together, produce core code, and then that core code is adopted and used under a set of rules. Copyright is one of the first elements of intellectual property that's involved, because there's a whole series of licenses that compliance managers inside companies help to untangle and ensure that a company, when it puts out a product, understands the component elements in terms of code that are used. And then there's also a patent component. And I'm managing an organization that socializes this networking idea of companies coming together. And the general concept that I'll talk about that's part of everything OIN does is that where we collaborate and want to be able to be free to adopt without fear of litigation as a result of kind of this project-based innovation that occurs in the community and around the world, we shouldn't be suing each other. The rest of the intellectual property landscape is very much as it was, where we're constantly companies are looking to innovate and find places where they can differentiate their products and services. They use patents to do that. OIN is very much a pro-patent organization. We are looking always to support higher quality patenting. I'll talk about some of the ways that we do that. But essentially, Linux is very much unbranded. Everything that we do, every electronic touch that we have is pretty much enabled by Linux. If you have a Chromebook, that runs on the Linux kernel. Self-driving vehicles, whether it's the Apollo platform that is being produced in China by Baidu, or whether it's a platform in the US, Europe, or North Asia, they're all running on Linux. Every Google search that you do runs on Linux. Every time you take money out of an ATM machine, every time you're on social networking, pretty much every stock exchange and commodities exchange in the world runs on Linux. Air traffic control systems, the lights that we cross at, all cloud platforms, whether it be a North American platform like Amazon or Google, or Red Hat / IBM or Microsoft, they're all running to some degree on Linux. Even if you have an iOS phone, Apple is obviously a proprietary platform, but there's a significant amount of open source code that is part of the iOS platform, even though it doesn't run technically on the Linux kernel. So it's kind of all around us. It's every part of every day in terms of our engagement with each other, our engagement with content, and it's quite important, even if it's not branded particularly well. It's really part of, open source is really part of a global movement toward increased software centricity. There aren't many companies that in the next 5 years are going to define themselves as being hardware companies. Almost every company in the world is differentiating and building more and more software into their products. When we started talking to kind of heavy machinery companies, whether it be John Deere or Kubota or any of the other companies, Caterpillar, they're all very interested, and many of those that I just mentioned are part of our network, our community, because of the importance of software, even to a business that historically is very much driven by individuals, trained individuals, and I think as a result of the importance of software to be able to provide control and create safer environments for people around work sites in a variety of applications. These companies have kind of gotten the message about the importance of software. In other arenas like electronics and telecom, you'd expect it, but pretty much every power grid is undergoing a transformation right now as well. And so that's not something we would have thought about 5 to 10 years ago. This notion of siloed development is really kind of, there are things that companies develop discreetly, but for the most part, because of the rise of software and the rise of open source as this modality, companies are collaborating more and more to produce content, produce code that truly can be shared and used. And that approach, taking shortcuts by building on each other's ideas, following certain regulations and rules, that's become part of the fabric of how companies operate. Particularly, it started in telecom and the enterprise, and it's spread to many, many, many different industries. And the diversity, the fact that we break down barriers through this collaborative activity between, not only between competitors and companies, but between political systems, technology is global, and the ability to contribute is global. And so smart people anywhere in the world are able to contribute and create higher levels of innovation. It's really about the democratization of innovation. It's providing access so that people don't have to, they can invent in situ without having to leave wherever they live in the world. They can contribute to projects remotely. And what it results is higher levels of innovation, more value to be able to be adopted, to be able to produce better products that are produced at a lower cost and offer a higher innovative component. Just looking at the Linux Foundation, which is one of the major project-based collaboration environments, they are really ushering in this notion, probably more than anybody else, of project-based innovation. The idea that we can come together on a variety of technologies. The Open Container Initiative, there's not many companies in the world that don't use Google's gift to the world, which is Kubernetes. And Docker is another platform that is rolled up into that. Hyperledger, which includes the development of application-specific blockchain code, primarily for ledgering within and anti-fraud mechanisms within the banking and financial services world, but that code is actually being used all over the place. The automotive grade Linux, it's changing the digital DNA of vehicles so that you have, in the beginning, you have the cabin of the future being redesigned around open source and utilizing Linux kernel to be able to do that through this AGL operating system. But ultimately, over the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see all mission critical applications running on the common platform inside a vehicle. And they're OPNFV, ONAP, Open Daylight, those are all major networking projects that have strong advocacy and support from most of the major telecom carriers in the world, AT&T being one of the more aggressive and passionate in supporting open source in the networks. And so it's a whole variety of environments, the cloud, security, networking, mobility, all projects where companies come together, 10, 15, 20, 200 companies coming together, produce next generation code that everybody can share and adopt. This idea of co-opetition, as I said, kind of came about from game theory in 97, is the notion that of collaborative development, that we're going to get a higher, a greater result in terms of interesting technology that can be used if we open the barriers between companies and allow for this collaborative development. And that's really where the power of open source is the how of it is where the interest is. It's not what it produces today or tomorrow, but it's what it has the potential to produce. And Linux is obviously the most important project and the largest project in terms of the number of commits, the number of code contributions, and the number of adopted elements of code that are in products. But there are many, many, many other projects, and reuse of code is one of the important things. You have constant reuse of code from one project to the next for different applications, because it's an environment that's very practical. And what's happening with patenting in this context is that you see people recognizing, I mean, we looked at, we have 3,300 companies in our community and growing, but we looked at Motorola and looked at their inventing activities in the 90s versus the 2000s. And it was a stark contrast. Right around 99, 2000, 2001, Motorola started to move very aggressively toward utilizing and adopting open source code in its products. And its invention activities shifted. They're much less low in the stack inventing, much more high in the stack inventing on look and feel, GUI. And they also recognized in that time that, that companies that were really not that creative, but that were eating their lunch with a lot less of a technology component and a lot less R&D. At that time was Nokia, had really kind of had a major impact on Motorola during the late 90s. And so Motorola's, I think, market share went from 35% in 96 down to a fraction of that by 2001. And so we're seeing similar kinds of trends in companies across multiple industries as intellectual property departments start to work more closely around this concept to be able to understand where differentiation can truly be found and where it can't be found, and where there's this compact that companies are forming with each other around the notion that where we collaborate, we shouldn't be suing each other. And it's altering the intellectual property landscape, but it's certainly not in any way is it damaging the ability to find differentiation and innovation through the use of the patent system. And so this idea of open and closed, the duality of it, is something that more and more companies are coming to grips with. And more IP departments it's actually provided an opportunity. I mean, many of you will maybe resonate with this, but I've always looked at the IP departments I've been in, or run, or coordinated with as a business person inside companies, as there's a strategic dialogue that goes on inside a company. And very often, the IP directors, people on the IP team, are disenfranchised when it comes to that kind of discussion. And I think it's damaging to the ability to really to have as much of an impact as an IP department should have on the production and protection of novelty inside a company. And so I think this is actually creating an opportunity, the advent of open source, because a lot of people their mental model is shifting, if not fracturing, as they deal with the fact that there's this I'd say it's a major discontinuity in terms of how technology is developed, and a move to software, which is also quite different for a lot of companies. Someone who worked for me is now heading open source for Daimler, and Daimler is a very traditional kind of classic hardware company that is in the middle of a very difficult and painful transition, and they had to physically locate the software group in Berlin so that it could actually develop its free and outside the physical reach of the parent, so that they could actually tap into the creatives that exist in that part of Germany to be able to then positively influence how a hardware company adjusts to being more software centric. Just to put OIN in context, OIN was the first, just 15 years ago, it was founded, and then AST, RPX, Unified, LotNet. These are all cousin organizations, I would say. With some, we share specific DNA, like since Google founded LotNet, we've shared just about everything. All the back office, all of our contacts, the people who actually call people about joining the network. We've shared everything we have with LotNet, which is really designed as an anti-privateering program that Google developed, and I consulted on when it was first formed. And so, we work with them on a shared DNA basis, very collaboratively. We have very good relationships with RPX and AST. We've purchased patents from AST in the past through their process of disposing of patents out into the community. Afterwards, after they've licensed their members, Unified Patents does IPRs and a number of other things. We announced in November of last year that we, Microsoft, IBM, and the Linux Foundation would be funding and founding the open source zone to be able to target poor quality patents that read on open source and Linux functionality that are held by non-practicing entities. And so we evolved from our founding 15 years ago. IBM, I think it's safe to say that IBM's prides itself on being creative, clever, thoughtful, and taking a long view where intellectual property is concerned, and being acutely focused on quality, which is kind of always an overlay of what we think about and how we look at the world. IBM got together with Red Hat and SUSE, which was Novell at the time, because those were the two major platforms. The two, Red Hat Enterprise Linux and SUSE, really served as the foundational commercial positioning for open source and for Linux in particular to expand. IBM was not a stranger in the mid 2000s to open source. It made its first $1 billion investment in open source in '99. And it was a thought leader at that time and still is in open source. It recently purchased and closed its acquisition of Red Hat. So IBM, Red Hat, SUSE got together and then brought in Philips, Sony, and NEC and developed the notion, the model that I'm essentially proselytizing to the world, socializing, and creating community around. Later in 13 and 16, Google and Toyota came in and became funding members. It's a very unusual organization because we rely on the funding members. We don't have a business model. We work in a very polarized community where you have people who are on extremes. One, you've got the companies that have come to open source in the last, probably mostly in the last 5 to 10 years, that come from backgrounds of being very much proprietary companies, developing their own technology, and maybe even having successful licensing programs like IBM, Sony, Philips, AT&T, which are all in our community as licensees. Some of them also founders and funders. So these companies had the wherewithal to be leaders. They funded this entity to the tune of $20 million each. And have supported OIN with additional capital and to enable us to be able to create community, to create a network of companies committed to that general fundamental idea that where we collaborate, we shouldn't sue each other, and elsewhere, you know, the normal rules around intellectual property use and monetization apply. So we actually have 3,300 companies now that are part of the community, some of the largest companies in the world and some of the smallest companies in the world. I'll show you a kind of a sample of some of these companies in a little bit. They own over 3 million patents and applications. All of them are subject to potential cross-license, but in point of fact, a very few of them are actually in the cross-license because we didn't set this up, and IBM certainly didn't set this up to hollow out people's patent portfolios. They set it up to ensure that this collaborative model can sustain, and no one could utilize patents to slow or stall the progress of Linux in at least core Linux functionality and core open source functionality. We own ourselves over 1,300 patents and applications. We've spent $100 million acquiring those patents and developing portfolios. We do a variety of things. I'll talk a bit about it later, but you know, we were one of the largest filers in the first 3 years of the American Invents Act of pre-issuance submissions, attacking poor quality patents and providing prior art from our own internal team and from the community, the open source community, to ensure that poor quality, overly broad patents didn't get granted as filed, and that claim scope diminution at the very least, if not outright rejection, occurred so that we could focus on, again, that notion of quality. We're very supportive of the patent system. We're not supportive of overly broad patents that create subluxations or bottlenecks that then choke innovation. We have 2,800 packages. There's lots of things that are different about OIN than traditional cross licenses. And for number one, it's the largest global cross license in history, largest patent non-aggression community in history. And it's that way because open source is such a kind of a revolutionary thing. And so we look at major projects of the world and then designate what should be included in the Linux system definition, and then vet it with the community with lots of companies. This process takes a minimum of 18 months, sometimes 2.5 years. I think we've gone in between updates. Linux and open source are moving, so we have to expand the scope of the Linux system definition. There aren't many licenses that people sign that where the licensor can expand the scope of the cross-license obligation without approval of the individual licensee. And so trust is a very important factor. Normally, in a pre-COVID era, I was traveling anywhere from 260 to 300 days a year and meeting with companies, some of the largest companies in the world, and basically spending time with them, because if they're going to expose 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, 80,000 patents in the case of Canon, they're going to expose those to potential cross-license. They want to better understand what our motivations are, where we fit, and in some sense that we are going to be a good caretaker of the obligation that they are making through becoming signatories in the OIN community. And so the Linux system definition is made up of these packages. It provides the scope, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. In our community right now, 41% is essentially where you expect it, I guess, in the Americas. But very importantly, because of our focus, and also because of the rise of Asia Pacific companies in participation in open source over the last 10 years, we've grown significantly there and are very proud to have that larger percentage as members of our community. And EMEA is actually very significant as well. But when you further look below the surface, you see that we're also very successful in Latin America, particularly in small to mid-sized companies, companies that are innovative, that are software companies at their core. Probably 30% of this is just in Argentina, of the 18% of our total 3,300 company population. And so we're very focused on being a global company, global entity, and having reach that's very much tied into wherever innovation's occurring around the world. And so this is a representative sample of companies in various segments that are part of our community. Rakuten and Jio have perhaps the most advanced 5G networks that are operational right now, the most nimble networks. They both became live in the last year and a half. KDDI, AT&T, Verizon, Vodafone. I mean, these are all major players. Internet companies. JD.com does more transactions in a day than any other online sales service in the world. Yahoo, obviously, Facebook, Twitter, Alibaba. We have all of the big, the major companies: Baidu, Ali, Tencent, the Ant Group, which is Ant Financial, which is Alipay. The largest transaction platform in the world on a daily basis. Salesforce, Yokogawa, networking companies, Juniper, Cisco. Most of the major automotive companies in the world are part of our community. And Toyota, even got to the point where they recognized that they were essentially in a metal bending business, and they were number one, but in a market that was dangerously shifting and being disintermediated in terms of value by a smartphone and a Velcro. And they knew they needed to have a platform that they also knew at a fundamental level. And I think you see this with Ford, and maybe less so with GM, but you see a recognition that these companies need to emerge from the kind of stagnant situation that they've been in by redefining themselves as tech companies. And I think Toyota really prides itself on being a tech company, and as does Daimler, and many companies do that are in the auto space. But for many years, and this sounds a little harsh, but they've been eating their food pre-chewed by forming unreasonable levels of reliance on tier one suppliers. And those tier one suppliers are now going through a reordering of their relationships with all these companies and many more that are part of our community and that are increasingly reliant on software. And so I think it's a good thing for the auto sector as automobiles change and shift to become different kinds of environments than just getting us from A to B, and especially as self-driving becomes more prevalent over the next set of years. And so you see the same thing in banking and financial services. These are companies that maybe didn't have the rich history of the auto companies, but they're going through a similar level of reordering of their relationships with their suppliers as they try and get involved in in more fintech kind of, the SMBC, Sumitomo Mitsui Bank Corporation, just joined our community. They're one of the largest, they're one of the 3 largest hyperbanks in Japan. They recognize the need to incorporate Hyperledger code into their network. They were one of the first major banks in the world to do so. And most banks by now are utilizing blockchain code. But it's not unusual that, companies like Ant Financial, Tencent, which has 30% of the mobile payments business in China, and having the balance of that, the remaining 70%. I mean, these are gigantic companies, and every one of the mobile payments in China is cleared by one institution, UnionPay, which is a massive company, incredibly reliant on software and increasingly open source software. So this just gives you a feel of the kinds of companies that are part of the community, but they're really, they're 3,300, and there are, just a world-beating class of companies. There aren't many companies that are not part of our community. Huawei joined our community just 4 months ago. Baidu, as I said, is in the community. Most of the 26, I think 16 of the 26 automakers in China are part of our community. And you go down sector by sector. Once there's maturity and technical adoption of open source code, there tends very much to be a movement toward joining OIN. There's an inevitability to open source and adoption of open source code because of the efficiencies and the innovation benefit. But there's also a decision was made, not to belabor this point, but decision was made 11 years ago by the Linux Foundation that it didn't just want to manage Linus. Linus Torvalds, the developer and inventor, launcher of Linux. And they recognized that there were many, many opportunities to bring companies together in new technology areas and new sectors to be able to collaborate, to be able to advance technology development in software. And so they made a conscious decision that they wouldn't use the GPL v3, which has components of it that are somewhat polarizing, and that they would use only what are called permissive licenses. The Eclipse Foundation has a permissive license that can be used by anyone. Apache has a permissive license that can be used by anyone, and they're probably the 2 most popular permissive licenses used today. So they wanted to remove barriers to participation by large companies that maybe had a toe in the water in open source 11 years ago, but weren't major players. And so what they did is launch a whole series of projects, hundreds of them literally, in the last 11 years, and all done under permissive licenses, and all somewhat concerning because the Linux Foundation knew this, but they were exposing companies to patent risk. It placed increasing reliance on OIN to live in the slipstream of these entities, because they all these entities, Linux Foundation and all the others that are listed here, and many others that are project management foundations. The Chinese just launched Open Atom, which will now be managing projects as well. These are global projects. They won't be China-only projects, but a number of companies have already announced participation and a transfer of their projects that they've been incubating internally in their companies into Open Atom. So, I could add them to this list. We're looking at project management organizations that are largely creating new projects where companies are participating at high levels and contributing code and developing code. And then once code is designated as core by those projects during code releases, we then look at that code, work with the community to figure out from our technical committee, which is one representative from each of our member companies, to an OIN Technical Advisory Council that we formed last year, about 18 months ago, which has a range of companies from around the world that help us vet this core code to make sure that it truly is core and that it's getting wide adoption. And then we we nominate that for inclusion in the Linux system definition, and our board approves what comes out of committee. But it's, as I said, it's a very long process. It's 18 months at a minimum. Often it's 2 years, 2.5 years, because the most important thing we do is getting it right and making sure that we're doing what our mission is, which is to protect the core of Linux and open source, and not to be including appropriately proprietary technology that's a source of differentiation for companies in our community. And so the scope of the cross-license, it's largely, I mean, there's a whole list of code, and if you don't work in software, this won't be very significant for you. You can recognize Google, but Google manages 2 curated projects, Chrome, which supports their Chromebooks, and Android, which supports just about 80% of communication through mobile networks on the face of the earth. So those are 2 very important projects, and then there's many projects here that are listed that work in a variety of different areas and different segments of the community. Mostly it's common base packages. It's stuff that comes out of the Linux kernel. Then it's software engineering things, which allow us to create code. And then enterprise computing, because that's where the enterprise is which is the longest standing kind of environment in which open source has existed. And then we go to mobility, networking, security, cloud computing, the web, and other stuff. But it's basically, we're just following this pattern of looking at major project management organizations, working with the technical leads of the individual projects that they manage, and then including through a vetting process that core code in the Linux system definition to expand the scope of the cross-license obligation. So technical development and collaboration occurs in parallel with legal collaboration. The technical collaboration is occurring between companies in these projects, and then what OIN is doing is essentially facilitating legal collaboration, a collaboration that comes in the form of a license that supports patent non-aggression, limitations on litigation that makes sense for everyone concerned, and the notion of cross-license. This is an example of kind of an S-curve that shows you the maturity of certain projects. Linux is the mother of all projects and is responsible probably for 75% of everything we have in the Linux system definition. And then Android, Chrome, OpenStack, which is a significant cloud project, Open Container Initiative, which deals with containers and Kubernetes, automotive grade Linux, ONAP, and all the networking projects, Hyperledger, which I talked about, which is blockchain, and the LF Energy project, which is very important to really make our energy networks much more efficient, more software centric, and more effective in delivering and transferring energy on and off the grid. It's particularly easy in Europe, and that's where strides will be made soonest. The way the U.S. energy networks are architected, it's a bit more challenging to be as effective and efficient early on. Really, OIN's about building community. When I talk to companies about why they should participate, I'm talking to them about the fact that we're establishing a set of norms, a set of values. And I think as Microsoft, early on in our history, it's no secret that OIN was formed to deal with monolithic threats like Microsoft that were very antagonistic with their patent portfolio and with their rhetoric to open source, clinging to the idea that they could, without any argument, the most successful software company in the world, that they could hold out, that open source was an anomaly. It was not something that would be used in mission critical applications. It was not scalable. And so those arguments proved not to be correct. And in order to grow its Azure business, which is its cloud business, Microsoft recognized that there was no way to get from from where they were to where they wanted to be unless they embraced open source and recognized this duality of open and proprietary, which I talked about earlier. And they came to me and they said, you know, we recognize we need to participate in the community, which was a major development for the community and for OIN, because in some sense it was what we were created to be able to have an effect to limit the negative impact that they and companies like them that were absolutely committed to utilizing patents to slow and stall the progress of Linux. They came to me and they said, you know, we recognize that when it all comes down to it, OIN's a litmus test of whether we're authentic in the community. And if we don't participate, we thought we could just stay outside and be fine, but we're not able to hire people at the rates we want because Linus Torvalds once told me there are 35 million coders in the world. There are 1,000 that matter. He's prone to I'd say exaggerate and to be highly critical. But the point is that I took from him is that there are only a certain number of truly talented coders and everybody wants to compete for them. And unless you position yourself as authentic within the community, it's not just joining OIN, but it's how you behave, how you participate in projects, how much you contribute back, a whole number of factors that coders observe. They have the choice of where they want to work, and they don't want to work in environments that have essentially morally bankrupt or detrimental kind of approaches to the open source community, because it's something, I won't say it's a religion, but it borders on a religion. Coders are committed to the values of the community, and OIN has really just established a set of values that are complementary to those that are critical to how people perceive their identity and value in the open source world. So OIN's free. I made the point earlier that we are funded by 8 companies, 7.5 companies, depends on how you want to characterize Red Hat. But we are living off of the funds that they provide. We avoid making money because this community is incredibly, at its polar ends, is extremely anti-patent and no one should ever get any software patents, to extremely pro-patent. But the idea is, how do you basically bring everybody together in a common, kind of a common mission to support a common mission, if you will, that where we collaborate, we shouldn't be suing each other. Everywhere else, you know, normal rules apply. And so we don't get involved in the political or religious debate about software patents. We support the patent system, and we expect that through legislative reform, that, you know, in every environment of the world, that good patenting will be done and it will continue to support innovation. So we license companies all over the world. They don't have to have patents at the time that we enter into an agreement, enter the license with them. They may develop patents at some point, which would then be subject to the cross-license. There's zero cost for participation. And in addition to providing access to the cross-license, to all the cross-license patents, we're also licensing our 1,300 patents and applications on a royalty-free basis. So we spent $100 million. We're offering this up for free. And a lot of those patents are highly relevant to companies because unlike the patents in the cross-license, which are gated and controlled by the Linux system, they're very Linux-centric and open source centric. What we invent was largely invented to have an arsenal to be able to allow companies to better defend themselves by allowing us to forward deploy assets to third parties, to deter litigation, or to allow them to more effectively manage litigation, which we did for Salesforce, and allowed them to manage when they were being sued on Linux-related functionality and patents that were owned by Microsoft. We allowed them to more effectively manage their litigation, which made Mark Benioff happy and made the community happy, because they were not made an example of, because they had a relatively weak patent position at that point. We list everything on our website, all the patents we own, We don't have holding companies or cutouts or anything else. Everything is transparent. We have an online process for registration, for e-signing. We don't talk a lot about this on the website, but we're collecting and sharing prior art on a regular basis. I mentioned that we entered into this relationship with Unified Patents to found the open source zone. So we have pivoted since Microsoft joined 20 months ago. We have pivoted to focus more on non-practicing entity PAE risk than on operating company risk. And we're doing it in collaboration with Microsoft because it seemed fitting poetry to bring them in, and they were very supportive of doing the right thing. We're acquiring patents from patent antagonists periodically. We don't, most of it is just to keep it out of the hands of companies that would practice serial litigation. But we're constantly looking at what's available in the secondary market. We're inventing. A third of our portfolio is through invention activity. And as I said, we utilize we did it a lot in the first few years, and we're doing it in a more selective way now, utilizing the pre-issuance part of the American Invents Act. We file patents in front of where open source is going, so we do clearance. We are selling patents. So we'll purchase to clear, we'll invent to clear. We're selling patents on a very selective basis to companies at risk or in litigation. We've only had 4 sales in our history, so it's not designed to be a major source of revenue or to be done in a way that we want the patents to be useful. And because of eBay, eBay happened subsequent to the eBay ruling was subsequent to the founding of OIN. And so that changed what we felt we could do. We had to not be able to recognize we couldn't stand in the shoes of companies if we wanted to get an injunction, which is the only real way to motivate companies like Microsoft and others who are setting themselves up as antagonists. And we wanted to recognize that our assets could be useful to be able to level the playing field if and when Microsoft decided, and other companies decided, that they wanted to use patents to slow or stall the progress of Linux. Membership alone can be a deterrent. I think with some litigation, the companies that were being asserted against and or sued by Microsoft on open source Linux grounds came to us, became a member, and it changed the tenor of the discussion with Microsoft because of our willingness to share our patent portfolio. The prior art assistance, we're doing that on a regular basis. That's actually increased dramatically in the last 2 years because PAE activity has increased. And so we're always tapped into the community, identifying potential threatening patents, while we try to usually, if it's an operating company, we try and bring them into the community, and then the patents become part of the cross license. But if they're a PAE, we have to take other measures like the unified relationship and like the tapping into of patents in the market that we'd like to neutralize. And so ultimately, the only companies that, once a company is recognizing that it's utilizing open source in a significant way, once that realization becomes part of their consciousness, then OIN becomes a relatively easy decision, because the only companies that at the end of the day will be left standing outside of the OIN community are companies that want to be able to utilize their patents to sue on Linux related grounds. And so we don't see that there are going to be many companies that are in that category. If you look at the companies we already have, I mean, see, these are some of the largest, most successful licensing companies in the world. I mean, the IBMs, the Microsofts, the Huawei's, these are companies that don't treat lightly any kind of encumbrance on their patent portfolio. If they can recognize that this duality of open and proprietary and live with it, then we expect that all companies ultimately will recognize that the importance of participation, because the projects in which they're working expose them to a certain amount of risk, because generally the permissive licenses do not support strong patent control. And that's what OIN, why OIN is a natural complement with the trends over the last 11 or 12 years of an increasing number of open source, of important open source projects being done under permissive licenses. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present. And any questions? We don't have much time now, but offline, just send me an email. I'm glad to respond, glad to get on a phone call. This is a process of kind of, this is a lot of information to take in, especially if you're not that familiar with software. Even if you are familiar with software, it may be that this hasn't been something that's in your consciousness. And so, it's part of a process of education, socializing, and acculturation at its core. So thank you.
Thanks, Keith. That was a great presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Sure, my pleasure.
For those still on here, maybe we can give Keith a applause reaction. There you go. All right. Excellent.
So thanks again.
Absolutely.
Okay, take care.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Keith.
Bye.